Okay, we're trying something new. We're going to try a Facebook Live video for the wrap-up today for those who were not able to be here today. This is on Luke 8, the first few verses about the women who followed Jesus. And we're going to start with a short video from one of my seminary professors.
Women have been silenced in the history of the church because he who writes the story controls the glory. That is, men. Men have talked about men. Men have written about themselves. And in the process, women have been ignored. Not only have they been ignored, because they have been ignored and they haven't featured as they really were in the story itself, they get silenced. And so in the New Testament, there are a good number of women who many Christians in ordinary churches have never heard of, like Junia, or Phoebe, or Euodia and Syntyche. And Protestants are nervous about Mary. And they don't know what to make of Mary Magdalene. But these are women who figure prominently in the New Testament, particularly Mary, the mother of Jesus, about whom we know more than anyone else in the New Testament other than God, Jesus, Peter, and Paul. Mary would be next. Maybe you could add John in there. Well, women have been silenced because men have chosen to silence them. And I'm grateful to be a part of a seminary. I'm grateful to be a part of a movement in the United States and throughout the world that is seeking to resurrect and to give platform for the voices of women. And I often say, let the blue parakeet sing.
Shout out to Northern Seminary there. So, some of those women that he mentioned, Mary Magdalene, Mary, mother of Jesus, very prominent in the Gospel of Luke. Luke does more than any of the other gospel writers to name women and feature the stories and the voices of women. When Scott says, let the blue parakeet sing, he's referring to this book, which I bought for Jessica. The Blue Parakeet, it's about how to read the Bible. And then he's got a test case for how we understand women in the Bible at the end of the book. The Blue Parakeet's passages are passages in the Bible that make us notice something interesting and different and startling is going on here. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the women at the beginning of chapter 8. So this is Mary Magdalene. How many of you have ever heard it mentioned that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute or a sinful woman? Yeah? That's actually a pretty common misconception. In about 591, Pope Gregory I gave a message in which he mistakenly conflated Mary Magdalene with the sinful woman who anoints Jesus' feet. And so it started this long tradition through church history that looked at Mary as a sinful woman, which just simply was not the case. She had demons cast out of her, but that doesn't, or sicknesses healed, but that doesn't necessarily mean that she was a sinful woman or a prostitute. She was actually one of the most faithful of all of the disciples. So Mary Magdalene, she traveled with Jesus, as we saw here. She was at the tomb, and she announced the resurrection. She has been called the apostle to the apostles because she was the sent one to the sent ones. She was the one who told them that Jesus was alive. And she was probably one of the rich patrons. That word rich for these women who were sharing their resources with Jesus is the same word for the rich young ruler, which we read about in Luke 18. So that rich young man, Jesus said to him, sell all you have and give it to the poor, but the young man didn't want to do that, so he walked away sad. But these rich women did hear and heed that call from Jesus, and they did sell everything they had, and they used it to fund the ministry of Jesus. So Mary did what the rich young ruler did not do, and so did Joanna and Susanna. There are early church documents that say that Mary Magdalene was a prominent leader in the early church, just like Mary, the mother of Jesus, was a prominent leader in the church in Jerusalem. So she was not only one of Jesus' traveling companions and disciples, but also was apostolic. She was a leader starting new things in the early church. Okay, now we have Joanna. I love paper dolls. When I was a kid, I used to make paper doll clothes all the time. So I had a lot of fun making these. These are actually paper dolls from the story of Ruth, but I've changed them into different ones. Okay, so we have Susanna. And we don't know anything about her other than her name, but she was one of the rich women of independent wealth who supported Jesus. About a tenth of the patrons in that time would have been women. So most patrons were men, but some were women. But actually, in the Greco-Roman culture, that could be used as an insult against someone to say, oh, well, he's supported by women, you know. And so that was kind of an insulting thing. But Jesus was happy to welcome women as his disciples and women supporting his ministry as well. If these women were faithful Jews, which we would guess by their names, they're all Jewish names, they were also giving 10 to 30% of their income to the temple and the priests, and so they were following all the law for giving their income. So probably what they gave to Jesus was over, above, and beyond the tithes and offerings that they were already giving in the Jewish system. When Jesus talks about, when he says later in chapter 8, who are my mother and my brothers and my sisters? Kenneth Bailey says that when someone would gesture to a crowd that was only men, they would only be able to say, you know, these are my brothers, my uncles, my fathers. So there had to have been women in the group of disciples that he was pointing to for him to have said, who are my mother and my brothers, pointing to the group of disciples that included women, those who hear and obey. So there Jesus is saying that among my disciples, Susanna, Joanna, Mary Magdalene, and the many other women who were in that teaching tour with Jesus, these are full-fledged disciples, just like the men. Okay, we have Joanna, the wife of Chuza, chief financial officer for Herod. Dressed in fancy clothing. So Joanna would have been in an upper-level social class, and we know that some of Jesus's male disciples were lower class. So in this group of disciples who were traveling with Jesus on this tour, we had a mix of social hierarchy, which was not common. A rich woman wouldn't necessarily have associated with fishermen. So in Jesus's culture that he's building, we mix social hierarchy, just like we should in the church now. And, like Simon the Zealot versus a Herodian, someone from Herod's household, that's politically combustive. I wonder what kind of arguments they had with each other, or if Jesus was able to keep them together with each other. So there was diversity among the disciples. It's possible that Joanna's name could be Roman, but she has a Jewish name. In Herod's household, it's hard to say whether she was Roman or Jewish. Probably because that's at the point in Jesus' ministry where he was going to the Jews. She was probably a Jewish disciple. In Acts 13:1, Manaen is mentioned, and he was a foster brother of Herod. So it's possible that Joanna could have been someone who, in that household, shared the gospel with him and discipled him, and then he had a role later in the early church. So it's interesting to see that there might have been this small Christian community forming even in Herod's household, thanks to the influence of people like Joanna. Now, where did she get her money? We're not sure. We're not sure if Chuza was also, her husband, was also a Jesus follower. Whoops. And maybe he allowed her to use their family money to support Jesus. But it's possible that he wasn't a Jesus follower. It's possible, and this is speculation, but it's possible that he could have divorced her because she was following Jesus. And in that case, he would have had to give her ketubah, or the money that a husband had to give a wife if he divorced her. Because women couldn't support themselves very easily, they had sort of prenuptial agreements that said, okay, if the husband divorces you, he has to give you this money for your upkeep. So it's possible that he could have divorced her and sent her away, and then she would have had this money, which instead of then using it on herself, she followed Jesus, and she used the money to support Jesus' ministry. So that's one possible theory about where she got her money. We see that these women were at the cross. In Luke 23:49, it says that the women who had followed him from Galilee were with him at the cross, which is probably this same group of women, because these were the women from Galilee who were following him. And then in Luke 24 at the tomb, Mary Magdalene and Joanna are both mentioned. I have a couple movie clips. There was a show that came out a couple years ago called AD Kingdom and Empire. And Joanna is one of the characters in the show. Mary Magdalene is one of the characters. So I just want to show you one scene because it's cool to see how the show producers imagined these women and how they might have interacted in Herod's household. So in these scenes, they're talking with Tabitha, who we later know that, spoiler alert, Peter raises her from the dead. This is before she dies. So.
Excellent.
What have I missed?
This is Mary and Joanna.
Tell me.
We've been talking about washing and sewing and...
Nothing else whatsoever. No, you haven't. Tell me about the needle.
Jesus said it is easier
It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And what about a rich woman?
Now, say that again.
Later on in this episode, Tabitha decides to follow Jesus, and Herodias walks in as they're praying with her, and so they're discovered. And so Chusa has to try to defend his wife to Herod about why she was talking with Jesus. It's a great show. I highly recommend it. I think it's a 12-episode miniseries. It's really fun. But I enjoyed seeing how integral that they made the women in this. It goes from the crucifixion through Paul launching out on his first missionary journey. So it covers that start of the early church, and the women were very important in that. So what I noticed from this that ties into our whole lesson is that these were women who heard and obeyed, which Jesus says in 8:8. He who has ears, let him hear. And they heard and they clung to the truth, and it produced a rich harvest in their lives. And they had that good soil. They had that light that was uncovered. And they went with Jesus, preaching and teaching the kingdom. If they were traveling with Jesus, they were doing what the 12 disciples were doing. They were proclaiming the kingdom. They were doing miracles with Jesus. They were casting demons out of people. They were healing the sick. So they were incorporated in all of that ministry. In Jesus' life and ministry, he never made any distinctions based on sex. There was nothing that Jesus kept women from doing. For women to travel with a man at all like that was very unseemly, but Jesus didn't care what people thought. He welcomed women fully into his kingdom as disciples. So just as Jesus let women in his life preach and be his disciples, I think that applies to all of us. We want to be women who hear and put it into practice and then proclaim the kingdom of God.